Hi, Jenny. We're going to do another astrobiography today. Are you ready?
Sure. Yes.
All right. Who are we talking about today?
We're going to talk about Joan Jett. Ow!
Joan Jett. How exciting. Now, we both this week watched a documentary called Bad Reputation. And I believe that documentary is available in a bunch of different places. I think I watched it on Hulu. I don't know. I think you watched it on YouTube. I think it's also available on Amazon. So find that documentary, Bad Reputation, and watch it with Joan Jett's chart in hand. And I'm going to give you the information in case you don't have it. She was born on September 22nd, 1958 at 4 p.m. in Wynnewood, Pennsylvania. So she has a 25-degree Capricorn rising. And let's just open her chart up and take a look at it, Jenny.
Okay, sounds good. Let's see here. Yeah, she has a pretty fun, dynamic chart, interesting chart. So here we go. Here's our Joan Jett.
Yeah, she has a really incredibly complex, she's an incredibly complex woman. And this is a very complex and dynamic and very exciting chart. I think a lot of people know Joan Jett in a little window. You know, to me, after watching the documentary, I kind of break her career into three different parts. She initially came into the world with a band that she started called the Runaways. Is that what it was?
Yep.
The Runaways. It was an all-girl band. And then she sort of disappeared from the scene and came back with Joan Jett and the Blackhearts, which is probably her most popular period of time. And then she came back around Riot Girl stuff. I think I missed something about that. But you probably, if you're watching this, you probably know her from one of those three iterations.
Or you probably know her album, which has "I Love Rock and Roll" on it, because that's when I was coming of age, and I remember when that album came out, and she was wearing this pink coat on the album, and she was pretty badass.
She was really badass.
Yeah.
She was really she was quite something. So let's just we could chat and chat about her life, but let's look at the chart a little bit and see what comes out here. What initially jumps out for you, Jenny?
Well, it depends what order you're doing things, but I think just take it from the top. Think about hemisphere emphasis, all the planets being above the horizon for the most part, with the exception of the moon and Mars. But that's enough to give you an understanding that all the planets are above the horizon. And also, those of you who know the retrograde piece of that, there's not a whole lot of retrograde going on either. So that securely puts us in the southern hemisphere, meaning a person who's life is primarily going to be seen in public, it's going to be out there. And also a person who's probably going to have to work pretty hard to construct their own root system to withstand kind of the buffeting you get by living a lot of your life out in the world. And boy, that's true about Joan Jett. So that's my first thing. What about you?
Well, let's just look at the sun and moon here for a second and the rising sign, just to kind of get a grounding in some of the basics here. That sun in Virgo is at the very last degree of Virgo. And that suggests to me, a sort of like reaching for what's next. It's considered 29 degrees of any sign is considered somewhat unstable because it's kind of pushing into the next area. But Virgo, and you see she's got a bunch of Virgo planets up there. And I just love Virgo. And you would not think initially, your first thought of someone with a whole lot of planets in Virgo wouldn't be, oh my goodness, this is somebody with a bad reputation, because Virgo is so polite. And, you think of it as being very, kind of tied together, neat and tidy,
Yeah.
not badass. But
Yeah.
but she's clearly, and you see that in her work, the perfectionism of her work.
Yeah.
Someone in that documentary talked about that. Just you think of how kind of wild she showed up, but she was a hard worker and very dedicated to her craft.
Yeah, and those are all great Virgo keywords, and just the competence, the diligence, the
Right.
effort. I think about the whole just rolling up the sleeves and getting to work, and
Yeah.
just so much work involved in what she was doing that you may not have even thought about.
Right. And knowing, all that Virgo really understands potential and is willing and pushing in that direction of that potential. So that's a very strong energy for her. But then you look at her moon, and there's her moon in Aquarius, which really brings out a very different, um, unusual need for being, I think of the moon in Aquarius, the need to be socially significant in some unique, innovative manner. So I think that's an interesting moon. So the energy to put things together and do the work necessary, feeding that need to be socially significant in some unique way. And then she's got Capricorn rising. So there's another statement of the ability and the necessity to work hard.
Yeah, to move things forward. Yeah.
Yeah, to move things forward, and the seriousness. This is not, yeah, I mean, you think of someone with a bad reputation as just being all wild and crazy, and this is a very serious woman. It's interesting how many um, musicians have a really strong Capricorn component that you wouldn't necessarily think. But I see
Yeah.
that again and again, that ability to do what's necessary.
Yeah, I was thinking just off the top of my head, I was like, that's like Taylor Swift, a lot of Capricorn that you would never think, you know.
Yeah.
Um, it's interesting with the Aquarius moon too. That I think it's a fixed sign, so fixed air. So that's something it can stick with it. But it's also very innovative. It has a real brilliance to it. But also in the second house, it kind of brings in these undertones of needing to be self-reliant, like having to assess her own worth and value and put it to work. So that seems to be part of the picture too, I think.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. And
Okay.
then, yeah, I know where I want to go next. What about you?
I know where I want to go next too. So where do
Yeah.
you want to go next?
Just we're talking about sun and moon, so can't help but notice that they're part of a grand trine.
And that's exactly where I wanted to go next too. So we're on the same page here.
Nice. Yeah.
So we've got, whoops, wrong line there. Let's get this the way we want it. We've got a trine from the sun to Mars, trine from Mars to the moon, trine from the moon to the sun.
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah, and basically you see that the sun is at that last degree of Virgo, so it is in a earth sign. But with these two both in air signs, I would consider this an air grand trine, which, yeah, a grand trine is an incredibly dynamic statement of self-sufficiency. What else would you say in just glancing at that grand trine?
Well, there's a stability to it. Just having that configuration between it's interesting having the sun and the moon. It's very often that you don't have the sun and the moon in a grand trine. You may have one or neither, but to have both really brings in that this is at the forefront of the personality. This ability to kind of marry the two things together: the sun in Virgo and the moon in Aquarius, and then the drive and the willpower and the take action of Mars. And in Gemini, it's going to be thought out. It's going to really be carefully considered as well. So
yeah, and that free flow of energy of this grand trine being in air, it's the Mars in Gemini, it's about speaking, that direct action with her voice.
yeah.
Certainly, and that brings my mind, unless do you want to say more about that grand trine?
No, my mind was going to the next piece too of where I thought that might go next. So yeah.
That's what I'm thinking
Yeah,
of.
totally. And just, yeah.
Yeah,
Same.
yeah.
And
And
for me, my mind went there because Mars is in Gemini, which is Mercury's sign, and there you have Mercury in its own sign of Virgo, and what this turns out to be is a very powerful Mercury, about the mindset and the thought processes, and actually a kind of a signature planetary energy in the whole chart. This thought process.
right. And the
Mhm.
voice of it. And yeah, her voice.
Yeah, her
Um,
voice.
and, one of the things that when I look at a chart of someone born in the 40s or the 50s, I always look at the middle degrees of Virgo. Why is that so, Jenny? You know.
Because in the 60s we had that very powerful conjunction Uranus Pluto in Virgo, and it was pretty exact, I think, 1965 and 66. So you want to see what happened at that time in her life. And what happened at that time in her life, Lori?
She got her first guitar right at about age 8. She kept pestering her parents. She wanted a guitar, and they bought her a little, $15 guitar at Sears or something. And that was, when Uranus and Pluto came together, that was a huge, for any of you who were alive there in the mid 60s, no matter where or what you were doing in your life, it was a huge shift. I mean, it's what made the 60s what they were, and or what reflected what the 60s were. But having those two planets, you think of Uranus waking up her values and her voice, and Pluto transforming her values and her voice. And she got that guitar, and that's where she put her voice. That's
Mm-hmm.
just, I love that. I just love to see that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
That's great. Love it.
Now,
Cool.
where's your mind going to go next?
Well, I think for me, it's that we've covered this nice grand trine, but there's a lot of squares in this chart. And the first one is boom, just squaring that Mercury Venus conjunction. You have Saturn, the taskmaster, squaring that. So that's kind of where I thought next. So Saturn is really, putting these planets through their paces, like really being like, again, that signature of get to work. You gotta learn, you gotta get to work.
Right. Yeah. And you think about that little kid, 8-year-old Joan Jett, with her new guitar sitting on her lap, and Saturn, like, yes, your voice is being awakened and you've got to work hard for it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And you're going to take on that effort and do that work. I think that's lovely to contemplate that. And the next thing that jumps out at me is, when we know somebody by their name, how we know them isn't from their sun sign, their moon sign, or their rising sign. It's the midheaven that keeps them in our awareness years after they've been popular, right?
Hmm.
So if we look at her midheaven, it's in Scorpio. So why does, and the name of the movie is Bad Reputation. So we've got this darkness of Scorpio on that midheaven, and we've got, of course, we've got Uranus squaring that midheaven. So
Mm-hmm.
here she is with this need to be socially significant in an unusual way with that moon in Aquarius, that moon ruled by that Uranus squaring that midheaven. So where is she going to be of some sort of social significance? Well, it's going to be through this dark, wild window of her career.
I love that. Well said. Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, her career is going to bring up all this. And why was her career this bad reputation? What was socially significant about it, Jenny?
It's the fact that it was an all-female rock and roll band in the 70s. And
Right.
it was just, she was told over and over again how women don't play rock and roll, women don't play electric guitars, women don't, and she just went on anyway. And
And
just
she was. I
yeah,
mean, she was the
put together
first.
the band. Yeah.
Yeah, she showed up, and she was like the first woman that like really did hard rock and roll.
Yeah.
And yeah, so that was very socially significant. She opened that door for women. And then with her band, the Runaways, it was an all-girl band that ended quite dramatically.
Hmm.
You can see that ending in that Uranus squaring the Scorpio midheaven as well. Um, and I see this chart with that Virgo, the Venus and Mercury, and just there was such an idealism.
Yeah. Yep.
And let's talk about idealism a little bit. Where do you see idealism in the chart, in her chart, Jenny?
Well, the other spot is, besides Mercury, Venus being so close together, that can indicate that. But the big one is the Neptune Jupiter conjunction. And that just is like idealism blown up big. It's sort of a double underscore on idealism. So that really shows up. And then what is it? And then those are squaring the moon as well. So that brings that idealism right to the very core of her being, her beating heart of that moon in Aquarius makes it very, very important. So it just, that's where it really shows up. So it shows up in the Scorpio, Sun Scorpio as well, to do with groups because it's in the 11th house. So that idealism is what you were mentioning earlier, kind of got broken apart when the all girls band of the Runaways failed. And that was a pretty big defeat. She disappeared for a while after that.
Yeah, the disappointment of losing that connection was, when I watched that movie, it was just such a clear, people often will ask, well, what's the problem with idealism? Well, you can see it when the Runaways broke apart. What happened to Joan Jett was exactly the problem with, idealism. That's, you've got this idea and you put it up on a pedestal. And when that falls off that pedestal, it can break your heart. And I think, the sensitivity of all that Virgo was so broken.
Yeah.
And she really went down a dark, dark path, as often musicians do. Idealism, I think, is a very common issue for musicians. It's that Neptune component as well. But yeah, she hit a hard, hard wall. And luckily, someone brought her back from the brink.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
She had a new, so she went from that to the Joan Jett and the Blackhearts. I liked it that the guy who, I can't even remember who he was, that kind of brought her back.
Yeah.
And then they went and they like put an ad that they were looking for 4 good men to work with Joan Jett. And she kind of worked with men at that point and brought herself back.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that I know I'm blanking on his name too, but they ended up having they have a long partnership around work. That was quite interesting to see.
Yeah.
And very helpful.
Yeah.
But also I just wanted to mention, underscore again, just like with those things squaring the moon, just the depth of, the moon represents your most vulnerable self. So to have that happen, it really brought it to a very, very personal place for her. So yeah. And I see that you highlighted the sextile to Pluto. Was that what you're gonna bring up?
I just thought that was really interesting, with Pluto ruling the midheaven, the fact that it is sextile that little gathering there with Jupiter and Neptune as well. And that brings in I think the musician part as well. Her career really had the opportunity to bring in the Neptune and the Jupiter, which is a good statement there. The other thing that I don't want us to neglect is that square.
Right. Yeah. I was like, I know there's another one. Yeah. So this is power. Pluto square Mars. It's just a potent blend there, and that provides quite a bit of energy at this person's disposal. So that's a that is a serious resource.
Yeah, and if you think, I mean, we've been talking about the midheaven being Scorpio, ruled by Pluto, but Scorpio is ruled by Mars and Pluto.
Mhm.
And her midheaven, what we're using here is whole sign houses. So her midheaven falls here in the 11th. I mean, she certainly, through her career, built this community of people who supported her ultimately.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
yeah, there's a lot of very, very powerful statements in here. And, one thing that I kept thinking as I was watching the documentary is oftentimes when I see a grand trine in a chart, a concern that I have is that a person can just get kind of stuck in this easy place of the grand trine, which for her, the easy place of the grand trine is getting on stage and doing her thing. That's where she feels good and she can move her energy and yeah, she can do her work. But it's all these other places in her life that are difficult. And yeah, in seeing a grand trine, sometimes people will get stuck in the easy stuff and won't do the hard work. But with her, it's like she didn't have a choice with those really hard squares that she has. She did the work first and really got the benefit later, rather than riding on the benefit and avoiding the work. I don't think she was given that option, probably, yeah, with these hard aspects.
Mm. Yeah. Yeah, the one other thing I just wanted to say, like sometimes when you see Mars and Pluto together, it signifies a person who maybe is a bit closer to their kind of more animal nature, like they're more kind of like this kinship with, beyond things other than human. And what I love about this is part of her work in her later years has been around supporting the PETA, which is the ethical treatment for animals. And so really, I love that. And also, there's a couple different ways that shows up. But then also the other communities she supports is a lot of LGBTQ like bands are coming out. So
And,
anyway, I love those two things. So
and
yeah.
I just noticed a little note I had written here and I completely forgotten about it. Didn't she do a whole lot around the military?
Yes. Yeah.
It's one of the most unusual things about her, but that's really part of that
Yeah.
reflection. She did well, I can't remember, what was that about?
I think she went and played some music for them and maybe raised some money for vets or something like that. But what I thought was cool is that she kind of said, hey, you know what, I'm not a supporter of the war, but I want to extend my support of how hard it is to be in the military and be part of the troops, so that's a brave stance to take.
Right.
I admire that she's able to say,
Right.
hey, I
Yeah,
don't agree with this, but I want to support you. Yeah.
to make that distinction with
Mhm.
someone growing up in the 50s, 60s with Vietnam War, to be able to make that distinction. I'm not going to support war, but I'm going to support these people that are caught up in this. That's really, really
Yeah.
interesting. Really interesting. Okay.
Great.
Anything else?
It's such a cool chart. I mean,
Such
you
a-
know, the only thing I would just add is that a lot of these patterns we're talking about, if you were to kind of go deeper down the rabbit hole of astrology, you would see these patterns underscored in a few different ways in the chart. But you don't need to do that. It's just an interesting thing. But wow, what a chart.
Wow, what a
Quite
chart.
practical. Yeah.
What an interesting life for some girl, growing up in Pennsylvania.
Yeah.
She's a powerful person. She's still with us. So watch that video and leave us some comments. I hope you learned something from watching this. And thank you for being here.
Thank you, everybody. Thanks, Lori.
Bye.
Bye.